Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. I'm your host, Michèle Belot from the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations and the Economics Department. So today we're looking at how to cultivate and sustain meaningful connections with co-workers and the impact that can have on your career. And I'm so pleased to be joined once again by my colleague, Sockin, who is assistant professor also at the ILR School and the Department of Economics. Welcome.
I'm pleased to be here with you as well. We don't always get the time actually to sit down and chat, so this is actually gonna be really nice.
Yeah, great. Looking forward to the conversation. Viewers, we're interested in hearing from you today, and we'll take your questions, so please submit them in the chat. And heads up for resources, tools, and useful links in the chat as well. In addition, we'll be asking for your participation in a few poll questions. So heads up for a QR code that will appear before we ask the questions. And as always, so today's live stream is being recorded and will be available to view shortly after the show today. And also, did you know, Jason, actually, that keynotes are also simulcast to YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook Live. So we'll share links to those channels in the chat as well. Okay, so let's get into it. So why do you think we need to actually talk about social connections and buddies today?
Yeah, no, it's something that I think a lot about, and I think there's kind of like two factors right now that kind of make me think a lot about the labor market and thinking about people sort of connections and who they kind of know and their friends and everything. And I think those two kind of things, one is this like recent development in the last couple of years, this idea that people are becoming, more isolated, right? This idea that, the US Surgeon General in 2023 actually declared loneliness an epidemic, right? They had some statistics in their report. They said that, about half of Americans in 2021 reported having fewer than 3 friends, and that number has gone up to, gone down to about 27%, right, in 1990. So we see people becoming more, it says like isolated, fewer friends. We also see people spending their time differently, right? So if you look at like surveys, I saw a survey actually yesterday from Gallup talking about how people spend their time with friends, and we just see the number of hours people are spending with their connections is just going down over time. And this is especially true for older workers. So we see this kind of like one factor, which is that people are just less integrated, maybe with colleagues or with friends or social engagement, but at the same time, we hear these narratives about struggling labor market prospects for recent graduates. There's an article in the New York Times this past week that said employers are kind of in this low hire, low fire kind of dynamic. And so how do we kind of think about these two things where maybe people are figuring out, how do I get a job? And also, maybe I don't have as many friends or connections as I'd want or maybe used to have in the past. And so I think the confluence of those two things make it especially important that we talk about colleagues and buddies today. And so I think before we dive into our own research, I think we'd love to hear from the people who are tuning in. We'd love to know from you, the audience, have you ever received helpful advice in the past when searching for a job? And if so, what was it?
Yes, and so I think that's a great question. And while we are actually waiting for the answers, just want to show a slide looking at what resources people are using to find jobs. So at the moment, online resources and information are really the top resources that people are using. But as you can see, connections both with close friends or family or sort of more acquaintances, people you may not know necessarily super well, are also very important. And it's something that we've known for a long time. It's not something really new that people use their social connections to find jobs. And that's why it's quite interesting and relevant to think, well, what's going to happen if we actually have, less connections, we interact less with others. And sort of another interesting statistics maybe to share with our audience is that employers are actually also relying a lot on social connections to recruit people. So if we look at how do they, aside from job boards, which are the sort of obvious channel to actually recruit people, what other resources do they actually use? And we see that close to 72% say that they rely on referrals from current employees. And we'll come back to that theme later on how these referrals may actually play out. But it's interesting that social connections do seem to matter. But maybe let's look at what our audience is.
Yeah, our audience is saying a couple of things. They say, kind of in tune with what we're going to be talking about today, people get advice that they should be building relationships, that relationships are important. I know Michèle's work, which we'll talk about shortly, does tell us that. But we also see people mentioning customizing their CV and following up. We see connections and knowing your industry. And so I think there's a lot of things in there that people are getting this kind of advice. And Michèle, with some of her researchers, actually put out a recent paper trying to figure out, can this kind of advice, can having a buddy that can give you this kind of helpful or information really help you actually achieve better labor market outcomes? So why don't you tell us about your recent paper studying this?
Sure. So we were interested, so this is work we did in the Netherlands, but sort of we think the lessons are, of broader relevance. We were interested in trying to find a way to create connections, because of course we know, job seekers may have their own social networks, but sometimes it might actually be helpful to be connected to someone who is actually not that close to you. And in particular, we were interested in connecting people with others who have changed career. And the reason why we wanted to do that is that some job seekers seem to be looking for jobs in areas where the prospects are really poor. They are just, tons of job seekers, very few vacancies. It's quite discouraging. And so we thought for these people, it would make sense if they could actually perhaps change, their search and think about other occupations, other professions to apply to. But how do you do that? No, if you sort of ask me as a professor, why don't you go and search for, change your career? It's very, very hard.
No, I'm sure it's just very daunting to think about a whole new task, a whole new type of skill set that you might need.
Exactly. So we think in this sort of context, it might be particularly helpful to connect to someone who has actually recently made a transition and who might give you, helpful advice on how to do that. Mm-hmm. So this is what we did. We worked with the Public Employment Services in the Netherlands. We created a whole platform actually where both buddies and job seekers could actually register, so could enroll, and then could actually get connected. And then we looked at what happened to these people over time, so whether they first, actually connected with each other, and then later on whether they were more likely to find a job and have actually higher earnings.
Yeah, and these weren't just friends. These are random people that had switched occupations. So this idea that you can also formulate or create these kind of connections that could actually lead to meaningful impacts for these workers.
Yeah, and I think that we believe in, we have a lot of examples in many contexts actually of community, building, and people are willing to share their advice with others. And so we thought we could maybe tap into that in the sort of context of job search. It's actually a bit of an underused resource. And we think public employment services obviously see a lot of people going through, unemployment and actually finding jobs. But at the moment, there is not much that is done with, the sort of knowledge that these people might actually acquire while going through these experiences.
Yeah. So what did you find?
So we actually found quite, positive effects, not immediately. So it took a while, and the effects were actually somewhat stronger for those who were longer term unemployed. But we see after a year that those who were sort of treated. So the way we do it always is that we actually give access to the tool to a subsample of people, and then another sample is actually used as a control group, so a comparison group, and so we can compare outcomes between these two groups. And we see that the ones who did get access to the sort of buddy platform is more likely to be employed by 11%, and is also enjoying higher earnings of about 200, a bit more than 200 euro per month. And so these are actually quite large effects. But we sort of think maybe there is something indeed in sort of having someone who helps you to take the steps to look, further.
Yeah, and I think with your results, what I found really fascinating was, I think one reason you sort of think that these effects are are metastasizing or showing up is this idea that they don't get discouraged from their search, right? We think about long-term unemployed, you might not be finding jobs, it might be a struggle to sort of like hear back or get callbacks, and what you find is that like when you have a buddy, you actually keep searching broadly, that like you don't maybe narrow your search, that this idea that, maybe there's this encouragement that comes with it, that knowing that you're not alone, or that this is what part of the process is. But I found that really important, this idea that like maybe encouragement is what people really need throughout their job search.
Yes, and I think that we know that in labor economics, it's again something that is well known, that people get discouraged. We don't really know what is behind that discouragement, but indeed this idea of having a social support is very important to navigate these periods, and maybe indeed this one of the key mechanisms through which this may have helped is that you didn't get discouraged to the same extent.
Yeah, and I think the importance of what you find is just that we think about what remedies there are or what kind of policies that we could do for the long-term, people who've been unemployed for a while. We think about maybe job training programs, but those have mixed success. And so what I find really nice that this could actually be done maybe at scale, right? There's a lot of people, if I just connect people with other people that have gone through these process of either switching jobs or not, that maybe we can actually, bring people out of unemployment and sort of, reduce spells of how long people stay unemployed. So I find it really encouraging.
Yeah, and I think once you have the infrastructure, and we know we actually have a lot of examples of platforms that work with, peers helping others in other contexts. So we think it's not that difficult to think about this being scaling up. So
yeah.
But
and those buddies might have become friends, right? Because they may get off the platform and start messaging each other. So.
So I think this is work that hopefully is relevant more broadly, and so we hope to continue also maybe doing this maybe in the US as well. But so I want to talk to you as well about the work that you have done that is also relevant in the context of trying to find a job and trying to figure out whether a job is actually for you or not. And so you have a paper that is about, tell us the inside scoop and what's in the inside scoop. And so one could think that friends could be useful maybe to actually give you information that is hard to actually get otherwise. So you might, when you look for a job, what do you know? You know what's written in the job listing. You may actually be having some idea of the reputation of a firm, but often you don't really have a lot of inside information.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what you have learned from your work.
Yeah, no, I think a lot about these kind of issues. I really, try to study and focus on these informational issues that there's lots of things that workers care about in the workplace, but those can be really hard to find. And maybe if you have a buddy, they can tell you about their workplace, and that can be really insightful. But if you're just trying to find, there's lots of jobs and lots of employers, it's hard to know everything about these different companies. And so you might try to go online, right? There's job ads, but job ads may not tell you the whole story, right? And so, there are review platforms where people will talk about their experiences. And so in my research, or in this paper, What's the Inside Scoop, we try to understand this kind of information flow from experienced insiders who have been with the company and have this kind of information to share, and how people, job seekers interact with that information. And so, we actually studied first in this paper, we wanted to know, like, what kind of things do people want to know? So, if you look in this slide, that will present to the audience, that we sort of studied, because we could see with these reviews on this platform, people could actually rate what information was helpful to them and what information was unhelpful. And so these reviews have a star rating, not unlike Amazon or Yelp, or Glassdoor, which is what we'll be studying or looking at, is that there are reviews. And so a 1-star review is really negative, a 5-star review is really positive. And what we see is that people really demand or want to know the negative stuff. They want to know what isn't so great about that workplace. So really positive reviews get unhelpful votes, and really negative reviews get really helpful votes. And so we kind of see people want to know the inside scoop of what's bad in the workplace.
So is it because people are sort of negatively oriented, or is it because you think there's actually information?
I like to think people are optimistic. I don't think it's. I think there's a couple of things that are going on here. I think one is that just like, where are you going to go to learn this stuff, right? Is that like, if you look at a job ad, I always like to say, they're not going to tell you we have the worst managers in town. Why would they do that? You might not apply to that. And so you're going to get this kind of rosy kind of picture potentially. So I think it's where do you go to get this? Maybe this is exactly that kind of platform that can offer that. But I think on top of that is this idea that like workers really want to avoid bad places to work because they're really costly, right? I think people spend so much time at work that having a job that maybe they aren't satisfied with can be really costly. And if they want to switch jobs, that's also really costly because they have to get back into search. So I think it's this, what kind of workplace do you want to be in? They don't want to be in these negative workplaces. And so this is the kind of platform maybe where they can actually go to learn this kind of information.
And so you're saying that in these negative reviews, there is often something about I don't know, the atmosphere or the sort of colleagues and so on, or what are they talking about?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a wide range of things. We see different rates of discussion of different topics or amenities, as we might call them in the literature, but people really talk about their coworkers a lot. So people care about who they're going to be working with. People mention culture, they mention mentoring, they mention leadership. They want to know that they're at a place that's going to be stewarded in the right way and towards a sort of successful path. So I think it's a really broad range of things that can be on there. But one thing that I will caution is that as people want this negative information, it may not be the entire picture, right? Is that we're only seeing things that are publicly shared. And so, in that paper, what we do as well is we show that there's actually missing negative information. We're not getting the whole story. So even this review platform is not complete because people might be concerned about retaliation risk of if I post something negative, is my boss going to find out? And there are ways that employers can retaliate against their employees. They can reduce their hours, they can lower their pay, they can fire them. And so there's kind of this trade-off that maybe I want to help others, but how much do I want to expose myself to that risk of retaliation? And so even still, it's there's these issues of I can't maybe get the whole inside scoop. And so that can be where having a network can be really impactful, right? Because if you have a friend you trust or a colleague or maybe a buddy that is willing to tell you, they can give you the inside scoop that it's maybe there isn't this public concern about retaliation risk, but I tell a friend, right? And so if I know people in different employers, I can get more of these kind of true, kind of authentic inside scoops, if you will.
Yeah, so if you're talking to your friends, you're asking, well, how is the place? You sort of think that you're going to get better information than if you just look at what's publicly available, even maybe through the reviews. And
exactly.
So on.
I would hope our friends tell us the truth about their workplaces.
No, so I would just want to continue on this because, of course, when you are trying to find out, whether a job is for you or a firm, a company is for you or not, the other way you can potentially learn about this is through going through the interview and sort of you talk to people and you maybe get a sense of who these people are, maybe whether you are going to connect with them and so on. So you have a great paper on interviews, which is anyone who is actually going to go through an interview should read this paper because what I've learned is that you're more likely to actually take a job if the interview was hard. And so very sort of interesting findings. So why don't you tell us about what you do in this work and what we learn about interviews?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying it's great. I think it's really interesting and important to think about hiring is a funnel, right? And so, you're going on these job ads, you're trying to learn, you might do your research on this platform and try to read these reviews, but even so, maybe you try to get a large, a clearer picture through the interview process. And so what we want to argue in this research paper is that interviews are two-way channel. They're two-way dialogue. It's not just they're trying to learn, are you going to be a good employee? You want to know, is this the right place for me? And so, we study kind of why people turn down job offers. Not all offers are accepted. I think in our sample, I think it's about 20% of offers are turned down. And so people will turn down offers, and we want to understand why, right? They go through this process, they go through the interviews, they go through this maybe, intensive screening process, and they get to the end and they say, no, thank you. And so we want to understand why. And it turned out that when people thought the interview was easy, they were more likely to turn down that offer, right? And so, even within looking in the same exact position at the same company at the same time, it was the people who thought it was easy, they said this wasn't the right workplace for them. And so we wanted to understand, well, what information are they learning through that process, right? And so the information it turned out was that it seems like people get a sense of who they're going to be working with from the interview. The difficulty of the interview is a good signal for what, who are my peers going to be and people really care about their peers.
I mean, it's interesting because I think, so Jason and I were actually recently on a recruitment committee for the university, and it's true that one thing that we have thought is that when you interview candidates, it's really a two-way thing. They will also see whether you are actually a place for them. And I think this is super interesting to actually have data on this and be able to find that.
Yeah, I think there are other things also. I think like people also, when it's easy, they might feel like the employer is not that interested in them. Like for some reason, I think about, we kind of conclude the paper with saying that maybe the future of the labor market's a dating app, because it seems like there's like two-sided matching of like, do you want me and do I want you? And so it's like, we want to know the employer wants to hire us, but we also want to know that they won't just hire anyone that walks in the door. They want to hire me. And so I think the interview is an important signal potentially of that. And they want to learn, who am I going to be working with? Who else is going to be here? One thing I will say about the rejection rates, though, is that one thing we did find, in relation to this kind of idea of referrals and buddies, is that we found that people who were invited to interview as a referral, right? So we could observe that those workers who had referrals, they were more likely to accept the job, right? And so we think about that as like, it was actually better matches, we think, for these workers that, they were able to go to the employers, go to the interview for the company that they were interested in, that maybe their colleague or their friend from a past job told them about. And so we see that those workers are more likely to, maybe find better matches because of that.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. As an anecdote, I also had the privilege to interview Jason when he applied for the job. And of course, we gave him a tough interview to make sure he would take the job. Yeah, so I think this is great. Maybe we can actually look at some live audience questions. So we have a question from Joe here about what is the difference between a buddy and a mentor? You want to take that one? Or?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I can try tackling that, but I think it's kind of about I would say the dialogue and the boundaries, if you will. I think that one can turn into the other, but I think it is important to have this kind of understanding of what the relationship is, right? Like a mentor is that like, you want to make sure that you're getting advice from this person, whereas a buddy can, I think can move into, social dynamics outside of this. And so I think there's like one of those things where maybe mentors transition into buddies, but I think it's really important to have that kind of understanding of that, like this person is trying to maybe assist with my job search, but maybe they aren't willing to go to be a buddy. I think there is this kind of like line of like what you want to be with this other person. I can say that like in teaching, it's really important, I think, to kind of set, have these boundaries. Like as an instructor, you want to make sure that, you're the professor, you're not necessarily their friend, because that can get into boundaries of that, like you want them to do well, but you also worry about these kind of issues of like, being a friend might lead to sort of like favoritism or these kind of things, I would say. What would you say to that, Michèle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of overlap, obviously. I think that a mentor does not necessarily have to be someone who went through the same experience. I think we see buddies more as a peers who have actually similar experiences. But of course, they play this mentorship role as well.
Yeah. I think in the context of your paper, though, like it was like the mentor could become a buddy, but it was this idea that the mentor just has this experience that they can share with you, right?
Exactly. Yeah, no, so I think that's a great question. We have also from Alaya, which I think is also related to the study I talked about, where we have indeed an increase in the employment rate of the people who got access to the platform. And the question is, how do we see the success rate compared to the time and effort one needs to spend in finding, creating a relationship with a buddy? And I think this is a good question. It's true that it can be, it takes time to actually talk to someone and create a relationship. But on the other hand, again, we have a lot of evidence from many interventions that do actually always take time, whether it's retraining or actually going and spend time talking to an advisor. The effects we have here are relatively high. So if we think about where is it worth, spending time, maybe this is actually probably among the interventions we've looked at among the more, sort of profitable ways you can spend your time.
And I think kind of related to that is that, it kind of gets into like what is the mechanisms by which we can foster or kind of create these relationships with a mentor. Is that like, in your kind of setting, you kind of created this platform that wasn't existing before.
Yeah.
So you might have friends, and we know that it takes time, I think, to make friends, but there could be systems in place that assign you a mentor, right? So you can think about policies where recent graduates are assigned someone who recently graduated from the university as kind of a mentor. And there, it's kind of one of those things like, what's the difference between a mentor and a buddy? Is that the presumption is not that you are going to be friends, but that like, this person can share experiences and sort of help you through the process. So I think there are real things that you could do to sort of reduce the kind of like frictions that might generate in terms of like finding a mentor, because it can be actually really, you're sort of putting yourself out there if like you aren't automatically assigned one, going to someone in the workplace and be like, oh, will you be my mentor? We know people want to be mentored and want to learn, but like that's also a bit scary, right? I know we have this where like a student might ask us, will we be their advisor? And that comes with some like concern that maybe
Sure.
we'll say no. And so I think maybe, if employers kind of facilitate that kind of program or universities, maybe you reduce the kind of cost that it needs to get there.
Right, I agree. I mean, it's relatively easy, and actually we spend so much time on social media platforms and connecting with others and so on. So in the scheme of things, I think it's a good way of spending one's time. But I just, maybe it's a good time to actually move to a sort of second topic, and we'll sort of start with a poll question on this, which is about, when you are actually at work, when you have a job. We're going to talk now about, friends that you might have at work and whether it's a good thing or not, or how
I think it's a good thing. I mean,
so we'll just ask first, the poll question is, would you say you have, any close friends from your current or previous job? And so do you have any friends in your current job?
I do. I have many. I really like my colleagues. It's an important part of the job. I assume you do too.
We have a great group, and it's indeed very nice to actually go to work if you have, feel your colleagues are actually friends.
Yeah.
So really interesting, actually, result here is that we have 100% yes.
100%. I didn't know that was possible, but we have a poll where everyone who's responded has said that they have some person who's a close friend from their current or previous job, and I think that just kind of shows that like relationships that you form at the workplace really transcend and can go outside the workplace. We see people calling these, close friends outside the workplace, 100%.
Yes, and I think this is good to maybe sort of move into recent work that I have done with a PhD student here, where we looked with two PhD students, where we looked at what people say when you ask them, what do you like about your job?
And this was completely unprompted. Like you didn't tell them, you didn't try to prime them. You just said, tell us, openly.
Exactly. So we did a survey online, actually asking 500 people who have a job, so are employed somewhere, write an open text, about what you like about your current job. And it was actually a lot of fun to read the answers. But then we sort of use large language models to analyze, the responses and to try to categorize what are the things they talk about. And so maybe we can look at
tell us a bit about what people really care about, like for their best job, if you will.
Right. So we just asked first, what do you like best? And so you can see the answers here on the slide. But so the first thing is, things related to flexibility in work arrangements. So that's clearly important for people. But you see that the number two is actually relationships at work. And again, for us who work in the sort of labor economics context, it's interesting to see that things that we focus a lot on, like things like pay and benefits, or working hours and so on, also appear, but they are actually appear at a lower rank than things like relationship at work.
Are you sure you didn't interview 500 professors? Because I'm looking at those first three, and those are really important to me as well. Like having flexibility and doing our work, thinking about our relationships in the workplace, but also the autonomy that we have over our own workplace. So I very much agree a lot with what's sort of near the top there. And things that matter. Yeah,
me too, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And when we look at features that people dislike, so this is, I think they write that they don't like about their current job, and you can see their relationships at work is actually the top category. So that means that a lot of people also indicate that they leave their jobs because they don't get along with their colleagues. And so we think this is something that is maybe not taken as seriously always by employers. It seems like it's a bit second order and so on. So of course here we do see that pay and benefits do matter. So these are reasons, why people may be dissatisfied with their jobs, but also relationships at work.
Can I ask, before you had done this, the experiment where you asked people to say what they value, was there anything that you expected would show up that didn't, or were there kind of things that you're like, oh, this definitely is going to matter? Because sometimes we assume that this is going to be the thing, and then we realize if we just let people tell us, that's not the case. So maybe were you surprised by anything?
I mean, I think I was surprised by the ranking, no? So clearly things like the relationships at work being so important, and even perhaps more important than things like pay and working hours. I thought that was interesting. I mean, there are things that I think we should actually pay attention to as well, like in the features that people like best, there's the actual tasks of the job. So what do you do? Which seems very obvious, but again, in our research, it's something that is maybe not receiving as much attention as it should. We focus a lot on, contract features and, whether people are well paid, whether they have flexibility and so on. But, people actually also really care about what they actually do.
No, and I think that makes sense. I was going to say that, like, we also think about this as, people do, and I think you see this in what people like least. The second thing, people do care about pay. And so the thing is that, like, we study as economists, we try to think about, like, what is the trade-off people are willing to make? Like, if I have really great colleagues, maybe I'm willing to take slightly lower pay than I want. And so this idea that, like, these things, but we all have value to workers, and I call this, like, this bundle of things. And so thinking about, like, as the bundle gets better, as relationships are improved, if I have more autonomy, maybe workers are willing to work for slightly less because they have these really great attributes that they care a lot about this workplace. And, job search can be scary. I don't know what's on the other side, what that other employer might offer.
Yeah, and also sort of the flip side is that you may really not want to keep a job, even if it's well paid, because you don't get along with your colleagues or your manager is difficult. And so I think it's quite interesting. Actually, there is a recent Gallup survey that shows that employees who have a best friend at work are 3 times more likely to report feeling happy and satisfied with their work. So what's interesting is contrast a little bit with the statistics that we saw from the audience, but it's only 20 to 30% of employees who report having a best friend at work. So maybe, again, this is something we thought quite a bit about, can you actually do something about it? But we'll talk about it in a second.
I will just say one thing to that. I know we talked about interviews a bit before, but I want to bring up one more thing sort of relevant to this, which is this idea that, when people do these interviews and they tell us about them, they actually left some kind of summaries. They tell us, like, what they thought about. And so when you look at it, you did see this coming up where people would complain or they would maybe turn down the job offer because they felt like the employer was trying to screen on cultural fit and not on necessarily ability. And this idea that, maybe if employers actually really know that people care about relationships and culture and atmosphere and morale, if they screen on that too much, workers who are maybe, talented individuals might not like that. That's the thing. So I think there's a trade-off that employers might have to face in trying to, like, want to foster these kind of things, but also maybe trying to screen too much on them can actually lead to, this kind of issues and, A, who you hire, but B, also, like, people might get the wrong sense of the workplace.
Yes, no, that's right. And I think I want to actually continue talking about, this amazing, data that you have been working with for years now, sort of using data from the Glassdoor reviews. And so you are really, one of the first who really was looking at the relationship between, wages and non-wage characteristics of the job. So all these other things. So you just talked about it a little bit, but I don't know if you want to tell us more about what are the things that people really care about. How does this actually correlate with, wages in general?
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think this, data really helps us a bit understand the kind of like inside perspective of like getting, if you look at other data on employment or on wages, they won't give you the picture of how people feel. And this idea that I think feelings, and people like call it vibes, I think they really matter for workers' decisions to stay or to go to another place. And so what we did in these reviews, and kind of like what you did with what people talk about, like I think you studied 500, we have millions of people telling us in these reviews how they're feeling about this employer. And so we tried to look at what kind of things actually predict or explain happiness on the job. So, we had those 1 to 5 star ratings, and then what we said was, let's look at what things that they're writing about. And so in these reviews, people will say what the pros of the workplace are, what things they sort of like, and they also, tell us the cons. So what are the things that they really dislike about the workplace? And so, we applied some topic, some machine learning kind of things to study the text and get some kind of like topics. And what we found is that kind of related to the theme that people really care about their coworkers, and they care about their coworkers more than they care about pay, right? This idea that what led to satisfaction at the workplace was how happy I am with my coworkers, but that took many different forms, right? It's also like, were people happy with the mentoring that they were getting? Were they happy with the support system or the feedback system that this workplace offered? What was the morale like at this workplace? And so all these things entered into satisfaction with their employer more than their pay did. And so I think those kind of things, it's not saying that pay isn't important, it's just that I think what kind of people think about when trying to decide, is this the right workplace for me, is a lot of these interactions, a lot of these soft features of who am I around and what kind of culture is that cultivating.
And then, so I have a question with, thinking about, usually we can maybe associating firms that pay very well with some kind of maybe a more stressful sort of atmosphere and more demands on your time and more sort of expectations. So that maybe sort of go together with actually maybe a more tense atmosphere. Is this something that you think is going on, or is this actually more likely to be the case that if I have a great workplace that pays well, I'm also likely to have, great colleagues and a great atmosphere?
Yeah, I think it's kind of one of the sad realities of our findings that we know that there's, high levels of inequality in the labor market. There are workers who are receiving lower pay than others who are receiving higher pay. And what we sort of find in this paper is that when you account for all these differences in what we'd call amenities or these non-wage characteristics, when you account for things like culture, work-life balance, safety, all these different things, it only exacerbates this inequality differences, that good jobs are even better than we think they are, and maybe lower paying jobs are, have worse amenities, and so maybe not be, when we account for that value people are getting, that good jobs are even better than we think they are. And so what does that kind of tell us? It seems like we're actually undercounting inequality, this idea that things are all rosier maybe when pay goes up at the firms. Not every aspect, so you're right. There is this idea that higher paying jobs have more stress, right? It could be stress that's because there's job insecurity. I'm worried I'm gonna get laid off, right, if I don't perform enough. But also you might have working late in the evenings, right? You might have to work on weekends. It can be really long hours, and that does have trade-offs. But when we think about culture and coworkers, it seems like people are more satisfied. The same person, I would say, is more satisfied with these other dimensions, these culture, morale, leadership, management, support, when they go to a higher paying workplace.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it sort of goes a bit against one of the, I guess, the key theories that we have in labor economics about what we call compensating differentials. So the idea that maybe you have something that's not so great about your job, but then the employer will compensate with that with higher wages. And I think what's really interesting about your work is that you find, well, no, actually you get the best of all worlds, it seems, when you have a high-paid job. You also tend to get better culture, better other abilities.
No, exactly. And I think that maybe one of those reasons why that might be the case is that people sort towards these places, right? That if you have really talented individuals, they want all those really great amenities. They want a flexible schedule. Maybe they want to be able to work from home if that's being offered. They want to be around really great colleagues, and so they're going to try and find those workplaces. And so if I offer these good amenities, if I offer a better culture, that can pool or attract all these really talented workers. And so I think this kind of idea that it's kind of this public good that everyone can kind of feed from. And so I think that might be part of the reason why, is that you can have this pooling of really top talent coming to these workplaces. And so I think it makes them attractive workplaces to be.
No, I think it's really, really interesting. It will be nice to also hear, experiences from the audience, whether they do feel that indeed they have it all, if they have, a well-paid job, and at the same time, do they have actually nice colleagues and everything?
And I think, well, I was going to say, so I know that we would like to hear more from our audience about this idea of workplace connections.
Right. So maybe we can move to the sort of topic of maybe if employers are actually listening to us, or maybe people who are in firms and think, well, what can we actually do about the atmosphere at work? Maybe there might be sort of ways one can think about improving things. So we'll just start with a poll question, actually, asking the audience whether there are any sort of social events from the current or previous employer that were particularly memorable, or an event that you wish your employer had done. So the idea of, do you have the feeling that your employer is doing something about trying to trigger a positive sort of social atmosphere at work?
I can say one that we have here at Cornell, or at least in the ILR school, which I find really impactful, is every Wednesday morning we have this kind of coffee and breakfast. And so this idea that everyone in the building can come together. And so it's, for an hour Wednesday mornings. And so we have faculty from different groups coming together. And so, there's coffee, you're meant to sit around. And it's kind of trying to foster or facilitate maybe discussions that wouldn't happen if people were just going to their offices. So I know that's one that I really care about. What's maybe one that you...
I mean, I love to, so I really like, informal sort of social events, like going for lunch and going for coffee. And actually, probably, half of my research papers come out of, lunch conversations and coffee conversations. So it's very important for me to actually, talk to my colleagues in sort of an informal setting. So yeah, I think it's sort of interesting. So let's see the responses from the audience. So they talk about appreciation, family festival.
A potluck.
Secret Santa. That's
should we do
fun.
Something like that?
I think potluck. Yeah. So that's also something that we
family
recognize.
Festival. So kind of cooking. We have a craft fair. Maybe people all making different things together. Life event celebrations. Some saying that they're nice, maybe not so memorable, right? And so this idea that it seems like people have things that may stick out or things maybe that don't, but this idea that there are events that are going on. We have some here at Cornell. I know that that kind of leads into kind of research that you recently done about this idea that can employers actually facilitate, foster, create, or allow this kind of room for workers to create these kind of relationships. This idea of like, can we create bonding at work through this kind of like intervening by allowing these kind of events? So why don't you tell us about what you did in this paper? Yeah, so the first study I talked about was to create social connections between people who are in a context of trying to find a job. Now we are thinking about, well, once you're in the workplace, can you actually also try to do something about creating connections? And as I said, I sort of really believe in the power of lunch and the sort of these social events. And we wanted to do something that was relatively low key, so there's a lot of examples of team building activities where you have to go and build a raft and do something with your coworkers, but it's usually something that's quite costly. It's once a year and so on. It's not, it tends to be, maybe it's helpful, but it's quite costly for employers to organize that. So we thought, can we think about something that is just easier to manage and to implement on a sort of more frequent basis? And so we actually worked with a company that is in Kyrgyzstan. So this is actually a little bit exotic, but it is a white-collar firm, and they have about 1,000 employees that are dispersed across the country. And these people basically are involved in microfinance, so giving loans to small businesses. And so this employer was actually quite worried about retention and about, atmosphere at work. They really had the impression that the offices where there was a good atmosphere, people were staying, and the others where there was maybe not such a great atmosphere, people were more likely to leave. And so what we propose is, again, we did an experiment. So that means that half of the offices were involved in something and the other half were actually doing business as usual. And so the sort of treated group, what we offered them to do is to actually organize
for six different events once every 2 weeks, and they could actually choose what they wanted to do. We gave them a choice of activities that were meant to be inclusive, so things that are, everybody can do, that don't require special skills, special physical skills or anything, and that includes things like indeed a potluck or, a picnic or going for a movie night, playing some games.
I think you also had like flash mob, right? Was one
yeah,
of
they
them?
had to do a flash mob video. It was actually, that was probably the hardest one to organize.
But some people like
fun things.
But people did choose it, right? So you allowed the workplaces. Some workplaces wanted to do a flash mob.
Exactly, and so we thought it was fun activities. That's also something that we wanted to tap into. We know that if people have fun and laugh with their colleagues, they're likely to. That's more likely to be the case that they create a bond with their colleagues, and that can be helpful. So we looked at various outcomes then, including whether they were more likely to have friends at work, and then were more likely to stay with the firm. And we found support going in that direction. So they actually were more likely to report that they have a friend at work, and they were less likely to leave the firm later on. We actually did not find that did improve sort of individual productivity that much, but it did seem to improve the way the team was working. So as a team, they have a tournament actually between the different offices and the different teams, and we found that the teams that were treated actually were more likely to do well in that sort of competition. And we think this may also be the case that because when you work, as a team, there are always these tasks that nobody really wants to do, that it's a bit like this kind of public good task, and we saw that then maybe if you have a better functioning offices, you are more likely to actually do these tasks or pick up the tasks that maybe are not the tasks.
And I will say that I think it was that the people who were participating, the employees, they thought this was coming from management, right? So they didn't know that there was this intervention. They thought that the managers of the branch wanted to sort of like foster these kind of things, and so they kind of suggested it. And what I think is really interesting is that also in your setup is that like you allow them to choose what they want to do, right? And so, there can be trade-offs to being like, oh, this is going to be the event with no worker input. We know that there's lots of, great research out there that workers care a lot about voice, right? They want to be able to speak up, and, there's other work showing that maybe employers don't actually know what workers want, and so allowing them to do this is really important. But so I think that like also maybe I think picnics might have been the #1 most common one. So it's interesting that we see potluck coming up. That like it seems like picnics are a classic thing, and that they seem also like I think part of the nice part of your approach was that these are also relatively cost-effective things that like it's not that expensive to put on a picnic or a potluck, and so maybe it's kind of things that like it's not that expensive to really try to foster this maybe across workplaces even.
No, exactly. I think it's really, and what sometimes I think it's a bit unfortunate, because I think employees and employers might think this is a bit of a waste of time, and spending time having coffee with Jason, is that really productive? But it turns out that we do think that this is actually, we do see that it's productive and more likely to also have an impact on retention.
Yeah, and exactly. I think consistent with what we've kind of been saying, that like the branches that had these events, these team bonding events, if you will, they were happier on average, sort of with our satisfaction, so that people care about this kind of stuff. And then they also stayed longer, right? So there was a retention of delaying this idea that like maybe you make it a little bit harder to leave a workplace when you feel like there's attachments that are there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so. We have talked about social connections now for almost an hour in a very positive light. But of course, one can also, I think we should also discuss potential negative or downsides of connections. So there are several things we can think about. One is that we talked about social connections in finding a job, but you can sort of be worried about, oh, am I getting like privileged access? Is it like some kind of nepotism really going on? And then the other thing is that you might be thinking, well, it's nice to create these social connections at work, but maybe that leads to some kind of clubs and some subgroups of workers who get along, but maybe you might actually get more division than connection. So I just think it's nice to talk about.
I think that is really important. Is like, we're economists, so there's always trade-offs, right? We always think about there's no free lunches. That there might be upsides, but there's always might be downsides as well. And so I would say that like you think about, well, one thing that can happen is that like you can get a fractured workforce, right? If you do these kind of events, and maybe that actually creates groups of people that hang out with each other but not the others. So like there could be downsides in terms of like creating these kind of partitions that you maybe didn't mean to create, right? This could happen if you choose maybe this kind of idea that maybe a picnic is sort of more inclusive, but if you do something like a sport, maybe not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone is athletic or even cares about sports, and so you might essentially like be ostracizing employees, and that might actually make them feel worse about the workplace and make them leave. So I think there is downsides potentially in like on the individual or on these small groups, so maybe you feel like you're not part of the workplace if you're not getting along with the events that they're kind of designing. But as you said, you can also get nepotism of who gets hired. You can get these issues of homophily, that like you're only going to hire the same people from the same groups, and so that can lead to less diversity of thought, which can lead to maybe like less innovation or lower output. And so you think about, well, if we're always pulling from the same tap, maybe people might recognize that and go, I can never get a job there. They only hire from these types of schools or things like this. And so you might actually be missing out on talent because you're only focusing on people that are known through this network, right? And so I think there are those kind of downsides. I would say there's other downsides as well, right? I think in this kind of context, like, if we're going to do some kind of lunch together, if people spend 2 hours at lunch or an hour and a half, maybe that's more than you want them to spend at lunch. So it could be one of those things where people socialize or fraternize too much. And so from an employer's perspective, maybe, what's kind of the right balance there? I think that's hard to kind of find. You want that kind of connections, but is it at a cost? Because people, lounge a bit too much around the water cooler or around the cafe.
Yeah, no, so I love the idea that there are trade-offs. And actually, I have an anecdote, a personal anecdote related to the inclusiveness of these activities. So academia tends to be a relatively sort of male environment. And so in my first job, which I actually really, liked my colleagues, but the main, social activity was soccer. Mm-hmm. And then, so, I'm not such a great soccer player. So, and I also, didn't really feel like going and play soccer. But I realized that it was really the activity where a lot of information was exchanged, a lot of bonding took place and so on. And they always told me, you're more than welcome. You can come. And but it doesn't really, it's not. That's where it doesn't work. No, it feels like, okay, this is not an activity that is really inclusive. And one can think about, other examples and things that involve food and eating tend to be, generally working more for everyone.
And you might also be concerned that, like, suppose managers start socializing with their employees, right? And who they overlook. And so you could have this thing where maybe they start having favorites or favoritism in who gets promoted or wage increases, right? This idea, there's some research out there that, if you have a smoke break and managers spend it with certain employees, those employees are more likely to get promoted, right? And so this idea that you might actually be creating these divisions that actually might be very profitable for the employee, like, I want to get a promotion. So maybe you start investing in the idea of being social rather than actually being productive. And so I think there are these trade-offs. It's not obvious, but I think one thing that we have established is that, like, people do want colleagues that they are interactive with. I think it does matter. And so how do we facilitate that? That might differ by workplace, but I think that what employers can do and maybe try is, invest in those kind of things.
Yeah, and I think this is particularly relevant, maybe coming back to the sort of loneliness epidemic and so on. So we know, so Nick Bloom, who's a professor at Stanford, has done a lot of work on remote work, had, the first study that he had put out was actually showing that indeed, if you are doing remote work, you are less likely to be promoted as well, because you are probably not socializing as much with others and with the managers in particular. I think it's sort of interesting and important to think about how to actually maintain these connections in a workplace, particularly when you have people who might be hybrid or fully remote.
Yeah, and I think you might see this among employers of why they want people in the office, right? If you think that creates meaningful connections that keeps people there, I think there's these trade-offs, right? People want flexibility, but also if people are working remotely, maybe they don't have those connections or naturally, where either they learn or they just socialize with their employee or their colleagues, I should say.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So there's just a few audience questions that maybe we can take. We have maybe a
and maybe
few
if people
minutes
have any more, they can ask us about the workplace or about
drop your
social
questions.
Yeah.
So one question is actually about the Glassdoor reviews. Actually, I think it's a great question. Do you have any advice on whether or not employers should actively respond to negative or positive reviews? So you talked about, okay, so indeed the sort of worry is that you have somebody who's really angry at the employer or has, feels that they've been treated badly, goes and write a negative review. And that, from your research, it seems that might actually really influence whether, others decide to join the firm or not. So what can an employer do if that's the case?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think I'm going to interpret respond there as being to the employer do something about it, rather than like actively responding on the actual chat. Because I would say that there is research out there that firms do respond. So when employers get their first negative review, they will actually try to change practices potentially. Because I think recognizing that people care about this information that's out there. But I also think differently is that I think it might go unnoticed that sometimes employees have really good information because they're actually experiencing the workplace and it can actually make you more productive. So there's some work out there that actually looks at bakeries, right? And they sort of find that workers know kind of the processes that make things unproductive. And so when you listen to them and you ask them, what should we get rid of? It actually made the firm more profitable because they were removing these kind of tasks that may have been scaffolded on. And so might hear them complain about it. And so when you got rid of these really burdensome tasks, everyone was, profits went up essentially. And so I think that employees have good advice. I think if it's a negative thing that maybe you want to understand better, I think the thing to think about is that if one employee is saying this, maybe other employees are feeling this as well and maybe just not saying it because maybe they're concerned about retaliation. So I think engaging with it is what I would recommend.
But so, I think this is useful. But I'm still worried about, you have this really negative review, and could you avoid this maybe by polling your employees inside the firm? Do employers do that to actually try to get a sense of what employees might be unhappy about, but maybe in an anonymous manner? And so before it goes out there on Glassdoor for everyone to see, are there things that employers do?
Yes, and there is, and not always the most effective, right? So I've heard from friends who are in the tech space that they would get a survey about how they're feeling about their job, but their manager would read it. And so it was they'd have that conversation with the manager about what they could do better. And so the manager knew exactly who wrote what. And so there was no anonymity. And I think there's this real trade-off between anonymity and kind of the truthfulness that people are willing to share. And so I felt like that was completely ineffective because they would say that I can't really say anything because the manager is going to see exactly these kind of things. So I think there is evidence of people doing this. I will say that I have this other work that's in progress right now where we show that workplaces that are unhappier are more likely to unionize or try to unionize. And this idea that workers really care about these amenities, they care about the workplace, they want to be heard, they want voice, they want these kind of working conditions to be improved. And so, there is evidence that, some companies, I won't name them, it's been reported in the news, will try to survey employees and track satisfaction to try to avoid unionization efforts. This idea that recognizing that unhappy workplaces, workers might take action, and that could be in the form of unionizing or it could be in the form of, exiting or going on strike, right? So it's I think there is these things where employers will do it, and I think the kind of ways in which you do it, do I have anonymity or not, really matter for am I actually getting to the truth here.
Yeah, okay, so this is great. I think we have maybe you can take one last question from the audience. From Hunter, outside of specific studies, are there any books or other reading resources that you would recommend for someone in career services or those working to find work? So I think that's an interesting question. So we actually, I don't know if there is a book that come to mind. Actually, I think there are probably books out there, but I think I don't have one that comes to mind.
Yeah, no, I would say that there are. I'm not sure about books. I mean, I think academics will turn their papers into books at some point, but there are papers out there that will sort of summarize the kind of understanding. So like, I've looked into these for like the HR space of like this kind of interviewing in practice for interviewing. So like one thing that I kind of found out that I learned about is this idea of like realistic job previews, right? This idea that workers are more likely to accept a job and stay on a job when they get a realistic preview of what they're going to be doing on the job. And so the idea that they're learning their responsibilities and the tasks. And so those kind of things, there are resources out there for trying to figure out like what are the best practices on both the employer side and what workers are looking for. I would say that like basically academic papers that are published in journals and kind of like the HR space or in the ILR review, which Cornell hosts. I think those are all sort of great resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll put sort of the resources in the links, but also just feel free to reach out if you would like to, connect with us. We are happy to connect. And I think we can, that was a great conversation, Jason.
Yeah, it was really nice.
Learned a lot. And so thank you to the audience as well for all the great questions and for answering the polls. And so we're happy to connect with anyone who is interested.
Yeah.
Let's leave it there.
Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.